Alright, so here we're going to talk about angles in standard position. So now when we're talking about, or when we're dealing with trig functions, we are always dealing with some sort of angle somewhere, because a trig function is always going to relate to an angle. So it's very important that we understand all the properties of angles. So again, first we're going to talk about just the standard position of an angle. But in general, angles are everywhere. If you have the intersection of any two lines, segments, planes, you're going to create an angle. How do we label angles? Well, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times we use Greek symbols to label angles. So when we're labeling variables in an equation, we use our English alphabet, so X's and Y's and Z's and W's, usually. And usually, again, not always, we will see when we start graphing trig functions that we don't always use Greek symbols, but usually we use Greek symbols. And similar to when we're dealing with an algebraic equation, x is probably our most common variable. Well, when we're dealing with angles, theta is the most common variable used. Again, it's not always used. There are other symbols, and so here I have the Greek alphabet for you. When you join your fraternity or sorority in college, you might have to memorize that. For now, you do not. But those are some of the common, or that is the Greek alphabet, so those are common symbols you will see used to represent angles. Alright, that was a lot of rambling. So, before we get into an angle, how to draw an angle in standard position and some of the vocab, first, let's go through and I want you to label the quadrants by number. So we have 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I want you to pause the video, label which one is 1, which is 2, which is 3, and which is 4. Unpause when you are ready to verify your work. Alright, so hopefully you labeled the upper right corner 1, the upper left corner 2, the lower left corner 3, and the lower right corner 4. That's something you learned the first time you learned about the coordinate plane. It will come into effect when we look at angles in standard position here in a little bit. Okay, so a little bit of vocab. This is on your packet, so you do not need to copy this down, but you need to understand it. What is an angle? An angle is something created by rotating a ray about its endpoint. It has an initial side, which is the starting position of the ray. It has a terminal side, which is the ending position of the ray after rotation. And it has a vertex, which is the endpoint of the ray. You should be familiar with the term vertex. Triangles have vertices. Any polygon actually has vertices. Those are the corners, but the official math term is vertex or vertices. When we're talking about a specific angle, it is a vertex. So draw an angle and label its initial side, terminal side, and vertex. So initial side, if we look again at the definition here, an angle is created by rotating a ray about its endpoint. The endpoint is the vertex. So we start with just a ray. So if I draw a ray, and now I'm going to rotate that ray, but it's also going to stay where it originally was, so I'm going to end up actually with 2 rays, one of which is the initial side, and then I'm just going to draw some angle or some other ray here, so this will be the terminal side. And then the rotation, since this is the initial side and this is the terminal side, the rotation was in this direction. So this is what I'm going to call my angle theta. And that's the vertex. So that's an example of an angle. It does not have to be an acute angle like this. You know, you could have, let's say, Here's my initial side. Here's my terminal side. And that's the angle theta. You can even have an angle bigger than 180 degrees, which is something that we might not be as used to. So I can have initial side, and let's say this is terminal side, and this is my angle theta. So those are just some examples of some angles. And the understanding the vocabulary of initial side and terminal side is very important, because that's going to come up a lot when we're talking about some other properties of angles. So what is an angle in standard position then? Well, an angle in standard position is an angle with a vertex at the origin and an initial side on the positive side of the x-axis. So here's where we want to start to understand our quadrants. So if an angle is in standard position, its vertex is here at the origin, and its initial side is the positive side of the x-axis. So an example of an angle in standard position could look something like this, where here's my theta. So again, this is initial side, and terminal side. So on the remaining two graphs that you have, I want you to draw two other angles in standard position that are different than this angle drawn here. Pause the video, do that, unpause when you're ready to check your work. Okay, so your examples might look different than mine. That's okay, as long as you have an initial side. And the reason why it's important to recognize, well, not only what's the initial side, because this is in standard position, so it has to be the positive side of the x-axis, but also the rotation of the angle tells us which direction or which side we're starting from and which side we're finishing at, which is the terminal side. Terminal, terminate, finish. So here's one example. Here's another example that I did. So here is my initial side. I go all the way around. Here's my terminal side. You may be wondering, well, how come the rotation is always going this direction, counterclockwise? Is that normal? Does it have to be that way? That's a really good question, if you're wondering that. If you're not wondering that, now maybe you are wondering that. That's something we're going to address in a little bit. Okay, so we really want to make sure we understand the standard position of an angle and the vocabulary of initial side and terminal side. That's very important.